The cobblestones of Amsterdam's Prinsengracht Canal were slick with March rain, the kind of cold, persistent drizzle that seeped through coats and settled into bones like a persistent ache. It was 1943, and the city that had once been a jewel of culture and commerce had transformed into something else entirely. The graceful canal houses with their distinctive gable facades still stood, their reflections rippling in the dark water below, but the life had been drained from them. Nazi flags hung from requisitioned buildings, swastika banners turning the familiar cityscape into something alien and threatening. The sound of jackboots on cobblestones had replaced the friendly chatter of merchants and the laughter of children playing by the water's edge. 26-year-old Sophie Jansen pushed her flower cart along the canal path, her hands red and chapped from the cold despite the worn gloves she wore. The cart was old, its wooden wheels squeaking with each rotation, paint peeling from the sides to reveal the bare wood beneath. In the cart, arranged with care that seemed almost defiant given the circumstances, were bunches of early spring flowers. Daffodils, their yellow heads bright against the gray day. Tulips, though not the magnificent varieties Holland had once been famous for, but smaller, hardier blooms that managed to survive despite the war. A few sprigs of pussy willow, their soft catkins a reminder that somewhere, beyond the occupation, the fear, and the daily grinding misery, spring was still trying to arrive. The Germans who passed her on the street barely glanced at her cart. To them, she was just another Dutch woman trying to scrape together a living in occupied territory, selling flowers to whoever had a few guilders to spare. They saw what they expected to see, a peasant woman, unremarkable, harmless, beneath their notice. Some of them sneered at her cart as they passed, making jokes in German about foolish Dutch women selling flowers while their country burned. One young soldier, barely old enough to shave, had stopped her the week before and laughed as he crushed a bunch of daffodils in his fist, letting the broken stems and petals fall to the wet stones. Flowers, he'd said in heavily accented Dutch, his contempt clear. What good are flowers now? Sophie had said nothing, just bent to pick up the ruined blooms, her face carefully blank. She'd learned that skill in the 3 years since the invasion, the ability to show nothing, to let insults and cruelty slide off her like water off oil canvas. But inside, behind the blank expression, she'd been cataloging details. The unit insignia on his uniform, the slight limp in his left leg, the expensive watch on his wrist, almost certainly stolen from some Jewish family before they were shipped east. Every detail filed away, because you never knew what information might be useful. You never knew when seemingly insignificant observations might mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't see beneath their contempt and their certainty of superiority, was that Sophie Jansen's flower cart was much more than it appeared. Hidden beneath the false bottom she constructed with her own hands, working by candlelight in the cold cellar of her family's house, was a sophisticated network of compartments. Some held weapons, pistols wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Some held documents, forged papers that would allow resistance members to move through occupied territory with identities the Nazis wouldn't question. Some held radio parts, disassembled and carefully packed, to be delivered to operators who maintained the dangerous communication links between the Dutch underground and the Allied forces in England. And today, hidden in the largest compartment, cushioned by layers of burlap and surrounded by ice packed in sawdust to keep it stable, was something else entirely. Something that would, if everything went according to plan, strike a blow against the occupation that would be felt far beyond Amsterdam's canals. If you ever felt underestimated, if you've ever been dismissed as insignificant while carrying something powerful within you, then perhaps you understand what drove Sophie to push that cart through the dangerous streets. If you believe that courage sometimes looks like an ordinary woman with a flower cart, making her way through an occupied city while hiding secrets that could change everything, then maybe you'll want to see where this journey leads. Consider staying with her story, because what seems simple on the surface is about to reveal depths that will shake the foundations of Nazi control in Holland. Sophie hadn't always been a resistance fighter. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1940, she'd been a schoolteacher in a small village outside Amsterdam, living with her parents in a comfortable house surrounded by the tulip fields that had been her family's livelihood for generations. Her life had been simple and good. She taught children their letters and numbers, helped her mother in the garden, spent Sunday afternoons cycling to the countryside with her fiancé, Peter, a gentle man who worked as an accountant and dreamed of the life they'd build together after they married. The invasion had shattered that world like a brick through a window. She still remembered the morning the German planes had come, the sound of them filling the sky like angry insects, the bombs falling on Rotterdam and Hague, the radio broadcasts that became increasingly frantic and then abruptly silent. Her father, a veteran of the Great War, had sat at the kitchen table with tears running down his weathered face, understanding before most people did what was coming. "They'll take everything," he'd said quietly. "They'll bleed this country dry and call it order." He'd been right. The occupation had come swiftly and with brutal efficiency. The Germans had seized control of the government, installed their own administrators, and begun the systematic process of exploiting Holland's resources and destroying its Jewish population. Laws had been passed, restrictions implemented, freedom stripped away one by one until the country Sophie had known was almost unrecognizable. Peter had been arrested in the first year, picked up in a random sweep of young men the Germans suspected might pose a threat. He'd been sent to a work camp in Germany, and Sophie had received exactly 3 letters from him before the correspondence stopped. She didn't know if he was alive or dead, and the not knowing was sometimes worse than either certainty would have been. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes, a talisman and a reminder of everything the Germans had stolen from her. Her parents had been forced to give up their land, the tulip fields that had supported the family for 4 generations, now managed by German agricultural administrators who shipped the bulbs to Germany while Dutch citizens went hungry. Her father had died the following winter, his heart giving out one cold February morning. The doctor said it was natural causes, but Sophie knew better. Her father had died of a broken heart, of seeing everything he'd built and loved destroyed, of watching his country suffer under foreign boots. After that, Sophie had stopped being a schoolteacher. The schools had been closed anyway, or transformed into Nazi indoctrination centers where children were taught to worship Hitler and report their parents for disloyalty. She'd moved to Amsterdam, ostensibly to find work in the city, actually to disappear into the underground network of resistance that was slowly, carefully organizing itself in the shadows of the occupation. She'd started small, as everyone did, distributing illegal newspapers that told the truth about what was happening in the war, about Allied victories the Nazi-controlled press never reported, helping to hide Allied airmen who'd been shot down over Holland, sheltering them in safe houses until they could be smuggled back to England, carrying messages between resistance cells, her gender and her ordinary appearance making her less suspicious than the men who would have drawn more attention. The flower card had been her own idea, born from necessity and from understanding how the occupiers thought. She'd noticed that the German soldiers never really looked at the Dutch civilians who served them. They saw uniforms when they looked at each other, rank and authority, and the machinery of military power. But when they looked at Dutch people, they saw a conquered population, inferior and irrelevant. A woman with a flower cart wasn't a threat. She was barely even a person in their eyes, just part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the rain that fell constantly from Holland's gray skies. So Sophie had become the flower seller, a role that allowed her to move through the city with a freedom that would have been impossible otherwise. She had permits, carefully forged but indistinguishable from the real thing, that allowed her to travel between neighborhoods to source flowers from various suppliers. She had a regular route that took her past German headquarters, past the houses where high-ranking officers lived in comfort stolen from deported Jewish families, past the checkpoints and guard posts that controlled movement through the occupied city. And she listened, she watched, she cataloged everything she saw and heard, passing the information along to her handlers in the resistance, adding her small observations to the larger picture they were building of German operations in Holland, where units were stationed, when patrols ran, which officers were corrupt and might be bribed, which guards at which checkpoints could be counted on to be drunk or careless at particular times of day. The work was terrifying and monotonous in equal measure. Most days, nothing happened. She pushed her cart, sold a few flowers, carried messages or small packages hidden in her false compartments, and returned home to her tiny apartment near the Jordan district, exhausted and anxious, and wondering if tomorrow would be the day her luck ran out. Because luck was all any of them had, really. The Gestapo was efficient and ruthless, and the Dutch who collaborated with them were often worse, eager to prove their loyalty to their new masters by ferreting out resistance activity. Sophie had seen what happened to resistance fighters who were caught. She'd seen the bodies hanging from lampposts in the city center, left there for days as warnings. She'd seen the notices posted on walls listing the names of people executed for crimes against the Reich. She'd heard the stories, whispered in safe houses and passed along in coded messages about the torture cells in Gestapo headquarters, about the screams that could sometimes be heard from the street outside. She knew what awaited her if she was caught. And yet she continued, because what else was there to do? Collaboration was unthinkable. Passive acceptance felt like a kind of death. The only way to remain human, to maintain some sense of dignity and purpose, was to resist, even knowing the cost. Even understanding that she was probably to die before the war ended, Sophie couldn't imagine doing anything else. The rain was falling harder now as she turned onto Heroine, one of Amsterdam's most prestigious canals, where the houses were larger and more elaborate, their facades decorated with ornate gables and expensive stonework. This had once been a neighborhood of wealthy merchants and bankers. Now it was where the German occupation authorities had installed themselves, appropriating the finest houses for their own use, hosting parties in rooms where Dutch families had once celebrated births and weddings and ordinary life. Sophie's destination today was a house near the end of the canal, a beautiful building with a step gable and large windows that would have offered views of the water and the street. It was occupied now by a Gestapo officer named Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter, a man whose name was spoken in whispers and whose presence cast a shadow over the entire neighborhood. Richter was responsible for counter-resistance operations in Amsterdam, and he was very good at his job. Dozens of resistance fighters had been arrested, tortured, and executed based on his investigations. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely ruthless. He was also, according to the intelligence Sophie had received, about to make a trip. A convoy of vehicles would be leaving his house tomorrow morning, carrying Richter and several other high-ranking Gestapo officers to a meeting in The Hague. The exact route had been determined through careful observation and through information provided by a Dutch clerk who worked in the German motor pool and risked his life every day by passing along intelligence about vehicle movements. The convoy would travel down Herengracht, turn onto Radwestraatstraat, and proceed through the city center before heading south toward The Hague. There was a particular intersection where Radwestraatstraat met Peleastraat. That offered the best opportunity. Buildings on both sides, multiple escape routes through the narrow streets beyond, and a timing that could be calculated precisely based on when the convoy departed Richter's house. That's where Sophie would be tomorrow morning with her flower cart. And hidden in that cart, beneath the daffodils and tulips and pussy willow, would be a bomb constructed by the Resistance's best bomb maker, a nervous chemistry teacher named Hendrik, who worked in his basement, creating the weapons they needed from stolen materials and improvised components. The bomb was sophisticated for a resistance operation, designed to be triggered remotely by a simple switch Sophie would carry in her coat pocket. The plan was to position the cart near the intersection, wait for the convoy to approach, and trigger the device just as the vehicles passed. With timing that would, if everything went perfectly, eliminate several of the Gestapo's most effective operatives in a single stroke. It was a huge risk, the biggest operation Sophie had been involved with, the kind of action that would bring massive reprisals if it succeeded and certain death if it failed. The Germans would respond to an assassination of this magnitude with executions, probably dozens of randomly selected Dutch civilians shot in retaliation. It was a calculus of resistance, the terrible arithmetic of occupation where every action had to be weighed against the inevitable consequences, where striking a blow against the enemy meant accepting that innocent people would die in response. The resistance leadership had debated the operation for weeks before approving it. Some argued that the reprisals would be too severe, that they'd lose public support if their actions led to mass executions. Others argued that men like Richter were too dangerous to leave an operation, that the resistance fighters he'd capture and the intelligence networks he'd destroy, if left unchecked, would cost more lives in the long run than any reprisal. In the end, they'd approved the operation, and they'd chosen Sophie to execute it because she'd proven herself reliable, because her cover as a flower seller was well established, and because she'd volunteered, understanding fully what success or failure would mean. Now, the day before the operation, Sophie was making a final reconnaissance of the route, pushing her car along the canal, observing, noting any changes in guard positions or patrol patterns, making sure she knew exactly where she positioned herself and how she'd make her escape after triggering the bomb. She sold flowers as she went, maintaining her cover, chatting pleasantly with the few Dutch civilians she encountered, her face showing nothing of the fear and determination churning inside her. An elderly woman bought a bunch of daffodils, her hands shaking as she counted out coins. "These are beautiful," she said quietly in Dutch. "It's good to see something beautiful, even now." Sophie wrapped the flowers in a scrap of newspaper, one of the illegal publications the resistance printed, though the old woman probably wouldn't notice. "Spring always comes," Sophie said, the words both a platitude and a code phrase, a way of identifying herself to anyone who might need to know she was part of the network. Even when the winter seems endless, the woman's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simply an understanding that they were both surviving, both enduring, both waiting for a spring that might never come for either of them. Then the woman took her flowers and shuffled away, leaving Sophie alone with her cart and her terrible knowledge of what tomorrow would bring. She continued her route, pushing past Richter's house without looking at it directly, noting the guards at the door, the staff cars parked in front, all the details that might matter when the moment came. The rain had soaked through her coat now, and she was shivering, but she barely noticed. Her mind was running to the plan again and again, visualizing each step, anticipating everything that could go wrong, and preparing contingencies for each possibility. What if the convoy left earlier than expected? She'd have to be in position before dawn, waiting, ready. What if they changed the route? She'd have to abort, find another opportunity. What if a patrol stopped to question her right at the crucial moment? She'd have to improvise, probably trigger the device remotely and hope the blast was far enough away that she survived it. What if the bomb failed to detonate? She'd have to escape before they searched her cart and found it, and Hendrik would have to start over, building another device, planning another operation. And what if everything went perfectly? What if the bomb killed Richter and the others, struck a real blow against the occupation? Then Sophie would have to disappear, go underground completely, because the Gestapo would turn Amsterdam inside out looking for whoever was responsible. They'd question everyone who'd been near that intersection. They'd round up suspected resistance members. They'd torture people until someone, unable to bear any more pain, gave them names and addresses and information. The network would be compromised, and everyone in it would be at risk. Sophie had already prepared for that eventuality. She had a safe house arranged, a room in the attic of a sympathetic family's home where she could hide until the initial fury of the German response had passed. She had new identity papers, forged to withstand close scrutiny, that would allow her to move to a different city if she needed to completely restart her life. She'd written letters to her mother, still living in the village outside Amsterdam, carefully worded to say goodbye without saying anything that would endanger her if the letters were intercepted. She'd made her peace with the probable outcome. 26 years old, and she'd accepted that she likely wouldn't survive the war, that this operation or the next one or the one after that would be the one where her luck ran out. It should have been terrifying, that acceptance of mortality, but instead it brought a strange kind of calm. If you knew you were probably to die, you were free in a way that people trying to survive could never be. You could take risks, make sacrifices, do things that seemed impossible because you'd already counted yourself among the dead. That evening, Sophie returned to her apartment, a single room on the third floor of a narrow building in the Jordan. The room was tiny and cold, with a sloping ceiling that made it impossible to stand upright except in the center, a narrow bed, a small table, and a single chair. She lit the candles she kept on the table, conserving the small amount of electricity the Germans allowed to residential buildings, and sat down to write. She wrote to her mother, a letter full of ordinary details and carefully coded messages that would tell her, if she read between the lines, that something important was about to happen. She wrote about the flowers she'd sold, about the rain, about the spring that was slowly arriving despite the occupation. And she wrote, buried in seemingly innocuous phrases, that she loved her mother, that she was grateful for everything she'd been given, that she had no regrets about the choices she'd made. Then she wrote to Peter, even though she didn't know if he was alive to read it. Even though the letter would probably never be delivered, she wrote about their plans, the dreams they'd share before the war, the house they'd talk about building, the children they'd wanted to have. She wrote that she still wore his ring, that she kept faith with him even though she didn't know if he kept faith with her, that she hoped he understood why she made the choices she had. I couldn't just survive, she wrote. I had to fight. Even if fighting meant I wouldn't live to see the peace we were fighting for. I hope you understand that. I hope, wherever you are, you're proud of me. She sealed both letters in envelopes and hid them under a loose floorboard in her room, along with her real identity papers and a few photographs from before the war. If she died tomorrow and someone came to collect her things, they'd find the letters eventually. If she survived, she'd retrieve them and probably burn them, unable to bear reading her own words written from the edge of death. Then she lay down on her narrow bed, still wearing her damp clothes because she had nothing else to change into, and tried to sleep. She was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept returning to the plan, running through it obsessively, finding new things to worry about, new variables she hadn't accounted for. The hours dragged past, marked by the church bell nearby that rang every hour, the sound carrying to the cold night air. Somewhere around 3 a.m, she finally drifted into a light, anxious sleep, troubled by dreams she wouldn't remember when she woke. She dreamed of tulip fields and gray skies, of Peter's face receding from her no matter how fast she ran, of pushing her flower cart through streets that twisted and changed, never leading where she needed to go. She woke before dawn, the room still dark, her heart already racing with adrenaline and fear. This was the day. In a few hours, she'd either strike a real blow against the occupation, or she'd be dead, captured, her network compromised, everything she'd worked for destroyed. There was no middle ground, no partial success. It was all or nothing, and the outcome would be determined by factors partly within her control, and partly just luck, the random chances that determined whether bullets hit or missed, whether bombs exploded or failed, whether guards were alert or careless. She dressed carefully in her most anonymous clothes, dark and worn and unremarkable. She ate a small breakfast of bread and weak ersatz coffee, forcing herself to choke down food she didn't want because she needed energy later. She checked the pocket of her coat, making sure the trigger device was there, a simple switch connected by a wire that ran down her sleeve to a small radio transmitter taped to her wrist. Hendrik had explained how it worked. The signal it would send, the way the receiver and the bomb would respond. She'd practiced with a dummy device, clicking the switch over and over until the motion was automatic, until she could do it without thinking, without hesitation. Then, as the gray dawn light began to filter through her small window, Sophie left her apartment and made her way through the quiet streets to the safe house where her cart was stored. The bomb was already in place, installed by Hendrik the night before, armed and ready. The false bottom of the cart had been carefully arranged so that nothing looked unusual, the flowers positioned to hide any irregularity in the cart's depth, the whole assembly looking exactly as it always did. Sophie took a moment to check the cart thoroughly, her hands shaking slightly as she verified that everything was as it should be. The bomb was stable, well cushioned, the ice around it still solid. The trigger receiver was hidden in a waterproof pouch, secured in place where the detonation would have the maximum effect on vehicles passing close by. The escape route she'd planned was clear, leading through a narrow alley that German vehicles couldn't follow, then through a series of connected courtyards that would let her emerge several streets away, discarding her coat and becoming just another Dutch woman hurrying through the occupied city. Everything was ready. All that remained was to execute the plan. Sophie began pushing her cart toward Radwestratrat, taking the route she'd traveled so many times before. The city was waking up around her, people beginning their daily routines, trying to survive another day under occupation. German soldiers were changing shifts at checkpoints, tired night guards replaced by fresh morning patrols. A few early risers were already in the streets, workers heading to factories, women going to market with their ration cards, everyone moving with the careful, nervous energy of people living under constant threat. She reached the intersection of Radwestratrat and Paleostrat just as the church bells rang 7 times. According to her intelligence, The convoy would leave Richter's house at 7:30, taking approximately 10 minutes to reach this intersection. She had time to position herself, to arrange her flowers, to become part of the scenery, unremarkable and beneath notice. Sophie set up her cart at the corner, angling it carefully so that it would be as close as possible to where the convoy vehicles would pass. She arranged her flowers, making everything look natural and appealing, her hand steady now that the moment was approaching. The fear had crystallized into a cold, focused calm. This was what she prepared for, what she'd risked everything for. Now she just had to execute, to do what needed to be done. The minutes crawled past. A few people stopped to look at her flowers, and she sold a small bunch of tulips to an old man who reminded her painfully of her father. She made change, wrapped the flowers, smiled and chatted as though this were any other morning, all while part of her mind was counting down the minutes until the convoy would arrive. 7:25. The street was busier now, people moving through the intersection, going about their business. A German patrol passed by, and one of the soldiers glanced at her cart, but his eyes slid over it without interest. Just another flower seller. Harmless. Irrelevant. 7:28. Sophie's hand moved to her coat pocket, her fingers finding the trigger switch. Her heart was hammering now. So hard she was certain people must be able to hear it, but her face remained calm, showing nothing. She straightened a bunch of daffodils, using the motion to position herself with the best view down Radwistratrat, where the convoy would appear. 7:29. And then, in the distance, she heard the sound of vehicle engines. Multiple vehicles moving together. The convoy. They came around the corner onto Radwistratrat. 3 black cars moving in formation. The lead vehicle was open-topped, carrying armed guards who scanned the street with practiced vigilance. The second car, a large sedan, had curtained windows that suggested it carried the high-value passengers. The third car was another security vehicle, more armed guards, their weapons visible and ready. Sophie's hand tightened on the trigger switch in her pocket. Not yet. They were still too far away. She needed them closer, needed them right on top of her cart when she triggered the device. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the bomb's effect would be wasted. Too late, and they'd be past. The opportunity lost. The convoy was moving steadily, not fast but not slow either, the drivers maintaining careful formation. 50 meters away. 40. 30. Sophie could see the faces of the guards now, see the insignia on their uniforms, could see, through the window of the middle car as it passed through a patch of morning sunlight, the silhouette of a man in the back seat. 20 meters. 15. The lead car was almost on top of her position. In a few seconds, the middle car with its precious cargo of Gestapo officers would be directly beside her cart. This was it. This was the moment. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd risked, everything she'd sacrificed, all came down to this single second. Sophie's thumb found the trigger switch. She was aware with strange clarity of every detail of the moment, the smell of the flowers in her cart, mixing with the smell of vehicle exhaust. The sound of the engines, loud now, drowning out the background noise of the city. The feel of the rain on her face, still falling in that persistent drizzle that had become the soundtrack to her life under occupation. The weight of the trigger in her hand. So small and yet so heavy with consequence. She pressed the switch. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Sophie had time to think that the bomb had failed, that Hendrik's device hadn't worked, that she'd have to abort and escape and somehow try again. But then the world exploded. The blast was enormous, far larger than she'd expected, the sound of it like the end of the world. The middle car simply disintegrated, tore apart by the force of the explosion, metal and glass and fire erupting outward in all directions. The lead car was thrown forward, flipping over, the guards inside screaming as they tumbled. The rear car swerved violently, trying to avoid the carnage, and smashed into a building, smoke and steam pouring from its crumpled hood. Sophie was thrown backward by the blast wave, her cart destroyed, flowers and splintered wood raining down around her. Her ears were ringing, her vision blurred. But she was alive, conscious, aware enough to know that she had to move, had to escape before the surviving Germans recovered enough to start looking for whoever was responsible. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her side where something had struck her, probably a piece of debris from the explosion. People were screaming, running in all directions. The intersection transformed into chaos. The middle car was a burning wreck, flames and black smoke pouring from it, and there was no way anyone inside had survived. The other vehicles were damaged, the guards disoriented, confused, trying to understand what had happened. Sophie ran. She ducked into the alley she'd identified as her escape route, her feet slipping on the wet cobblestones, her lungs burning as she gasped for breath. Behind her, she could hear shouts in German, orders being barked, the sound of whistles as reinforcements were summoned. But she didn't look back. She just ran deeper into the maze of narrow streets and courtyards that she'd memorized, putting distance between herself and the burning convoy. She discarded her coat in the first courtyard, dropping it into a trash bin, removing the most identifiable part of her appearance. Her dress beneath was plain and dark, unremarkable. She forced herself to slow down, to walk instead of run, to become just another person moving through the city. Her hands were shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading, and she could feel blood trickling down her side where she'd been injured, but she kept walking, kept moving, heading toward the safe house where she could go to ground. The streets around her were filling with German soldiers, patrols responding to the explosion, checkpoints being hastily established to try to contain and identify whoever was responsible. Sophie moved through them with her head down, her face carefully blank, just another Dutch woman trying to navigate the dangerous city. She was stopped twice, asked for her papers, questioned briefly about where she was going and why. Each time, she answered calmly, her forged documents passing inspection, her story of going to work at a factory accepted without much scrutiny. By mid-morning, she'd reached the safe house, a nondescript building in a working-class neighborhood. She knocked on the door in a prearranged pattern, and it opened immediately, hands pulling her inside, the door closing quickly behind her. She was in a dim hallway, faces around her that she recognized from other operations, other meetings. "Did it work?" someone asked urgently. "Did you get them?" Sophie nodded, finding her voice with difficulty. The middle car was destroyed. Direct hit. No one inside could have survived. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then sudden, fierce celebration. People were embracing her, pounding her on the back, their faces showing a joy and triumph that had been absent from their lives for so long. They'd struck back. They'd hurt the enemy. Men who'd seemed untouchable, who'd terrorized Amsterdam with impunity, were dead, killed by a bomb hidden in a flower cart and triggered by an ordinary Dutch woman they'd never have looked at twice. But Sophie couldn't share their celebration. She was thinking about what came next, about the reprisals that would follow as surely as night followed day. Somewhere in the city, German commanders were already planning their response, deciding how many Dutch civilians would be executed in retaliation, which neighborhoods would be subjected to brutal searches, what new restrictions would be imposed on a population that was already suffering. She'd killed German officers. Yes, she'd struck a blow against the occupation. But the price would be paid by people who had nothing to do with the resistance, ordinary civilians who'd just been trying to survive. That was a terrible arithmetic of resistance, the cost that had to be paid, and Sophie would carry the weight of it for the rest of her life. The reprisals came swiftly. By that afternoon, notices were posted throughout Amsterdam announcing that 10 Dutch civilians had been selected for execution in response to the terrorist attack on German personnel. The notices listed their names, ordinary people whose only crime was being Dutch and unlucky enough to be chosen by the occupation authorities. They'd be shot the next morning in Dam Square, their bodies left on display as a warning. Sophie heard the news in the safe house, hidden away in an attic room while the Gestapo tore through Amsterdam, searching for whoever was responsible. She read the names on the illegal leaflets the resistance distributed, and each name was like a weight added to her soul. She told herself that these deaths weren't her fault, that the Germans were responsible for their own brutality, that she couldn't have let men like Richter continue their work unchallenged. But the rationalization didn't make the weight any lighter. The search for the bomber intensified over the following days. The Gestapo questioned hundreds of people, arrested dozens of suspected resistance members, tortured prisoners for information about who'd been responsible for the attack. They found pieces of Sophie's car in the wreckage, identified it as the source of the explosion, and began a systematic search for any woman who'd been seen with a flower cart in that area. Sophie stayed hidden, moving between safe houses every few days, never staying in one place long enough to be located. The resistance network rallied around her, protecting her, understanding that she'd become a symbol of something important. They'd proven that the Germans weren't invincible, that even their most protected officers could be reached and killed. The psychological impact of the attack was enormous, spreading fear through the occupation authorities and hope through the Dutch population. But the cost continued to mount. More arrests, more executions, more families destroyed by the German response. Sophie heard about each new reprisal, each new atrocity committed in the name of maintaining order, and the weight grew heavier. She'd known this would happen. She'd accepted it as the price of resistance. But knowing and accepting didn't make the reality any easier to bear. Weeks passed. The initial fury of the German response gradually subsided as they failed to identify the bomber. Sophie remained in hiding, her old identity compromised, her life as a flower seller finished. The resistance leadership debated what to do with her. Some wanted to send her to England, to get her out of Holland entirely before the Gestapo eventually tracked her down. Others wanted to use her for more operations, to capitalize on her proven skills and courage. In the end, Sophie made the decision herself. She couldn't leave Holland, couldn't abandon the fight when there was still so much to do. But she also couldn't go back to the kind of operation that would result in mass reprisals. She needed to find a different way to resist, something that would hurt the Germans without giving them an excuse to murder more Dutch civilians. She became a forger, using skills she developed creating her own false documents to produce papers for others. She worked in hidden rooms and basement workshops, creating the identity documents that allowed resistance fighters to move freely, that allowed Jewish families to hide in plain sight, that allowed Allied airmen to escape back to England. It was quiet work, unglamorous and tedious, but it saved lives without provoking the brutal reprisals that military actions triggered. The war ground on. Years passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion, and stubborn determination to survive. The Allies landed in Normandy in the summer of 1944, and suddenly, impossibly, the end seemed like something that might actually happen. The Germans were pushed back, slowly and at terrible cost, their grip on Holland weakening as their resources were stretched thinner and thinner. The final winter of the war, 1944 into 1945, was brutal. The Germans stripped Holland of food and fuel, creating a famine that killed thousands. Sophie continued her work, forging documents, helping to organize the distribution of what little food could be found or smuggled in, try to help people survive just a little bit longer until liberation came. She was living in Amsterdam again by then, in a different neighborhood, under a different name. Her appearance changed enough that she could move through the city without being recognized. She was thin, worn down by years of stress and inadequate food, looking older than her 30 years. But she was alive. She'd survived when so many others hadn't. Liberation came in May of 1945, Canadian troops entering Amsterdam to cheering crowds and celebrations that lasted for days. Sophie stood in the crowd watching the Allied soldiers arrive, feeling a mixture of joy and profound exhaustion. They'd won. The nightmare was finally over. But the cost had been so high, so many people dead, so many lives destroyed, so much suffering that would take generations to heal. In the chaos of liberation and the immediate aftermath, Sophie tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. She reclaimed her real name, retrieved the letters she'd written on the eve of the bombing, reconnected with what remained of her family. Her mother had survived the war, though barely, aged dramatically by hunger and grief. They embraced in the ruins of their old village, both of them crying, both of them knowing that the people they'd been before the war were gone forever. Peter never came home. Sophie eventually learned that he died in the work camp in Germany, just months before the end of the war. She mourned him, but it was a distant grief, emotions that felt like they belonged to a different person. The girl who'd cycled through tulip fields with her fiancé, dreaming of a simple, happy life, was as dead as Peter was. In her place was Sophie Jansen, resistance fighter, forger, bomber, survivor. A woman who'd hidden a bomb in a flower cart and killed German officers and carried the weight of the reprisals that followed. She never regretted the bombing, though she thought about it constantly. It had been necessary. She believed that men like Richter had to be stopped, and the only way to stop them was through violence. But necessity didn't erase consequences, didn't bring back the 10 civilians executed in Dam Square, didn't undo the arrests and torture and suffering that had followed her action. In the years after the war, Sophie rarely spoke about her resistance work. The Dutch government gave medals and recognition to some resistance fighters, but she declined to participate in the ceremonies. She didn't want medals. She didn't want to be celebrated. She'd done what she'd had to do, paid the price she'd had to pay, and now she wanted only to be left alone with her memories and her ghosts. She never sold flowers again. Couldn't bear the sight of daffodils or tulips without thinking of that cart, that morning, that explosion that had changed everything. She found work instead in a government office, processing claims for war compensation, helping people navigate the bureaucracy of post-war reconstruction. It was quiet work, anonymous, and that suited her perfectly. Decades later, when historians began seriously documenting resistance activities and seeking interviews with survivors, Sophie was eventually located and asked to share her story. She was in her 60s by then, retired, living alone in a small apartment in Amsterdam, just a few blocks from where she triggered the bomb that had killed Hauptsturmführer Richter and his colleagues. She agreed to the interview reluctantly, speaking slowly and carefully about events that had happened more than 30 years earlier, but which remained vivid in her memory. She described the flower cart, the planning, the execution of the operation. She talked about the reprisals, her voice flat and emotionless, reciting names of people she'd never met who died because of what she'd done. The historian had asked her if she considered herself a hero. Sophie had thought about that question for a long time before answering. "No," she'd said finally. "Heroes are people who do extraordinary things and make everything better. I did what I had to do, and people died because of it. I helped win the war. Maybe I hurt the Germans. Certainly. But I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who survived when a lot of other people didn't. Someone who made hard choices and lived with the consequences." But if you've stayed with Sophie's story through every difficult moment, through the fear and the violence and the impossible choices, then perhaps you found something valuable in her journey. Her story isn't about easy answers or simple heroism. It's about the complexity of resistance, the weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances, the cost of fighting back against evil even when fighting back means accepting terrible consequences. If this story moved you, if it gave you insight into what ordinary people faced during the darkest period of modern history, consider joining our community by subscribing. Leave a comment saying, "I walked with Sophie until the end," to share that you made it through her complete journey. And if you found value in this deep exploration of one woman's war, a like would help others discover these hidden stories of courage and sacrifice. There are more stories waiting, more voices from history that deserve to be heard, more women whose contributions have been forgotten or overlooked. Stay with us as we continue to uncover these narratives, because understanding the past helps us navigate the present, and Sophie's story, difficult as it is, has lessons that remain relevant today. The next chapter in our exploration of women's experiences in World War II is already waiting for you.